Hello. You are a bowl of cream.
Yes.
Thank you.
She walked into that studio carrying 12 million copies of her own face and a loneliness that nobody could see. That is what you have to understand first. Before the cancer, before Ryan O'Neal, before the courtroom and the rehab and the documentary she filmed while dying, before all of it. You have to understand who Farrah Fawcett actually was on August 11th, 1978, the night she sat across from Johnny Carson in that red dress and told America she had made a choice. Because she had made a choice, she had just made the most frightening choice of her professional life, and she was not entirely sure it had been the right one. But what happened after those cameras stopped rolling that evening? What Farrah Fawcett pressed into the hand of Johnny Carson's producer as she was leaving the building would stay hidden for nearly 30 years. And the truth it contains is not the story they told about her, not even close. If this story already has something pulling at you, hit the like button right now and tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from tonight. Because what I am about to tell you is not the Farrah Fawcett they sold on a poster. This is the real one. Farrah Lenny Fawcett was born on February 2nd, 1947 in Corpus Christi, Texas, a Gulf Coast town where the summer heat sits heavy and the sky goes wide and flat to the horizon, and everything that does not grow roots gets blown away by October. Her father, James Fawcett, was a pipeline contractor, quiet, steady, a man who showed up every day and did not dramatize his life. Her mother, Pauline, kept an immaculate house and had a laugh that her youngest daughter would inherit completely. That particular kind of laugh that opens a room rather than fills it. Farrah grew up in a family that did not have excess and did not discuss it. What they had instead was closeness. Her parents stayed married their whole lives. Her older sister, Diane, was her best friend before she was anything else. Corpus Christi was not a place that launched stars. It was a place where girls graduated and married local boys and raised children in houses much like the ones they had been raised in. Farrah was supposed to follow that road. Everything about her background pointed in that direction, except for one problem. She was unlike anyone had ever seen. Not just pretty. Teachers noticed her in elementary school. Boys noticed her in junior high in a way that made their older brothers notice her too. By the time she reached WB, a Ray High School in Corpus Christi, there was simply no way around the fact that Farrah Fawcett was something that happened to a room the moment she walked into it. And she was not vain about it. People who knew her then said she carried her beauty the way some people carry a birthmark, as a simple fact of themselves, one they had not chosen and could not explain. She was popular and she was kind and she cheered for the football team and she studied hard enough to get into the University of Texas at Austin. She was studying microbiology. She had no ambitions toward Hollywood, no particular interest in modeling, no desire to perform beyond the school plays that most people forget the moment the curtain closes. But in her first year at UT Austin, she was selected as one of the 10 most beautiful students on campus. A photograph ran in a local paper. That photograph landed on the desk of a publicist in Los Angeles named David Mirisch, and David Mirisch called Farrah Fawcett's father with a proposition so simple it almost seemed like a joke. He said, "I can make your daughter a star." Her father said he would ask her what she thought. She said she would try it for one summer. That summer lasted 40 years. She arrived in Los Angeles in 1969, 22 years old, with a small suitcase and a Texas accent she would spend the next decade softening. Hollywood was not gentle to pretty girls in 1969. It was not gentle to anyone, but it had a particular set of uses for young women who looked the way Farrah looked. And most of those uses involved keeping you right at the edge of actual success without ever quite letting you through the door. She did commercials, shampoo, toothpaste, a skin cream that ran on television for years. She did small television parts, guest roles on shows that aired once and were forgotten. She worked. She took acting classes seriously in a way that surprised people who expected her to coast on her face alone. She was not content to be decorative. She had always believed she was capable of more than that, and she was determined to prove it, though the particular way Hollywood was arranged in those years did not make it easy to prove anything except that you showed up. In 1973, she married Lee Majors. Lee Majors was already known by then. Broad-shouldered, a man from a small Kentucky town who had built himself into a reliable television presence, 8 years older than Farrah, steady in the way she found steadying, and they had dated for 3 years before the wedding. Farrah was 26. There were people who said later that the marriage was complicated from the start, that two ambitious careers in the same city always find it harder than the people living them expect. But Farrah and Lee seemed happy. Or they seemed the way people seem when they are holding things together by the genuine force of their affection and their will, which is close enough to happiness that from the outside you cannot always tell the difference. What changed everything was a show called Charlie's Angels. Subscribe right now and drop your location in the comments. Because what that show gave Farrah Fawcett, and what it cost her, is a story that nobody has told completely. On the premise was three beautiful women working as private detectives for an unseen boss who communicated only by speakerphone. The network was not sure it would work. Critics were uncertain. Even the people inside the production hedged their expectations. But when Charlie's Angels premiered on ABC on September 22, 1976, it did not simply work, it detonated. 80 million people tuned in during the first season. Three women, Jacqueline Smith, Kate Jackson, and Farrah Fawcett Majors, as she was credited, became the most recognized faces in the country practically overnight. But it was Farrah who became something else entirely, because of the poster. In 1976, before the first episode of the show even aired, Farrah posed for a photograph that she did not entirely understand the significance of. A red one-piece bathing suit, her hair loose. A smile so natural it seemed impossible to have been staged. The poster went on sale. Within a year, 12 million copies had been sold. 12 million. It became the best-selling poster in American history. Every college dorm room, every teenage bedroom, every truck stop display in the country. Farrah Fawcett's face had saturated the culture in a way that had never quite happened before. More intimate than movie stardom because it was already there, in the room, looking down from the wall before you had even chosen to seek it out. And here is what that actually does to a human being. When you become a symbol, you stop being a person, not immediately. It happens slowly, the way water erodes stone. You cannot identify any single moment of wearing away, but one day you look and something essential is gone. Farrah had been raised to be a real person. She had grown up in a house full of realness, in a Texas childhood that did not traffic in abstraction. She was not built for the particular erasure that celebrity performs on the people it chooses. She felt it happening and she did not know how to name it. What she knew was that every morning she woke up and the world wanted something from her that had nothing to do with who she actually was. The world wanted the poster. The world wanted the hair and the smile and the red suit. The world did not particularly want Farrah Fawcett of Corpus Christi, who had studied microbiology and taken acting classes seriously and was trying to figure out what her life was actually for. And the world's indifference to that real person was a loneliness that no amount of fame could touch. So after just one season of Charlie's Angels, she quit. The lawsuit started immediately. Aaron Spelling Productions and ABC filed suit. She countersued. It became a legal battle that stretched for years. The industry was furious. People said she had thrown away the most valuable thing a television actress could have. They said she would regret it. They said she did not understand what she was doing. She signed with theatrical management. She announced she was going to make films. Real films. The kind that would prove she was more than a poster and a smile and a piece of hair that everyone wanted to copy. The kind that would prove the inside of her was worth knowing. The first film was Somebody Killed Her Husband. It opened in November of 1978, a few months after the Tonight Show appearance you just saw. The critics were not kind. One review noted with the particular cruelty that critics sometimes mistake for rigor that the film could not decide whether its star was a movie star or an actress. The box office was disappointing. And Farrah Fawcett went home at the end of the press tour and sat in a house in Los Angeles and understood for the first time the full weight of what she had wagered. She had bet everything on herself. She had bet that there was something real inside the image, and she had bet that the world would eventually agree. And in August of 1978, sitting in the guest chair at the Tonight Show in that red dress, the question of whether she had been right was very much unsettled. Don't go anywhere. Because what happened backstage that night is something that only one man knew for 30 years. Saying what it reveals about who Farrah Fawcett really was will stay with you. The Tonight Show taped at 5:30 in the afternoon at NBC Studios in Burbank for broadcast at 11:30 that evening. By the time Farrah arrived at the studio that August afternoon, the press tour for Somebody Killed Her Husband was already 3 days deep. She had been doing interviews back-to-back, morning shows, magazine profiles, radio appearances. The relentless machinery of promoting a film that you privately feared was not working. She was exhausted in a way that went deeper than physical tiredness. It was the exhaustion of someone who has placed a very large bet and is watching the table to see how the cards will fall. She sat in the guest dressing room for 40 minutes before the taping. Her makeup artist, and a man named Gerald Ramirez, who worked regularly with Tonight Show guests throughout that era, later recalled that Farrah was quiet that afternoon in a way that was different from her usual easy warmth. She was not difficult. Farrah was never difficult with crew. The people who worked these shows remembered her consistently as one of the most gracious guests they ever had, but she was somewhere inside herself. She held a small paperback in her hands without reading it. She looked at the mirror without seeming to see it. When the stage manager knocked to give her the 10-minute warning, she stood, straightened the red dress, ran her fingers once through her famous hair, and said something Gerald remembered clearly for the rest of his working life. She said, "I just need tonight to feel like something real." He thought she meant the interview. He did not understand yet what she actually meant. What happened on camera you already know. The easy jokes, the bright audience, Johnny's warmth, the professional grace of two people who understood how to make television work. What you could not see was what Johnny Carson noticed. Because Johnny, by August of 1978, had been doing this for 16 years. He had sat across from more famous people than almost anyone alive, and he had developed, through simple repetition and genuine curiosity, the ability to see through what they were presenting to what they actually were. Not to expose them, that was never his interest, but to see them, to register the human fact of them behind whatever they had built to protect themselves. It was the quality that made his interviews singular, and most guests felt it without being able to articulate why talking to Johnny felt different from talking to anyone else. He was watching Farrah carefully from the first moment, and about 12 minutes into their conversation, after the jokes about the poster, after the laughter about leaving Charlie's Angels, after the discussion of the new film, he did something that was not in his prepared notes. He leaned forward in his chair, just slightly, the way he did when something had genuinely caught him, and he looked at her directly and asked a question that had nothing to do with television. He said, "Are you okay?" Not as a host, not for the audience, who perhaps did not fully register the weight of the question in the flow of the conversation. He asked it the way you ask a friend whom you have just noticed is carrying something they have not mentioned. And for 3 seconds that the cameras captured and that you can still find in the broadcast record if you know where to look, Farrah Fawcett's face did something extraordinary. The smile did not disappear, but it became transparent. You could see through it to something underneath, something small and tired and genuinely uncertain. And then the smile closed again and she laughed and she said of course she was. She had never been better. She was doing exactly what she had always wanted to do. Johnny Carson nodded. He moved the conversation forward the way a professional host does. He did not press. He did not try to pull anything out of her that she was not ready to give. But something had crossed between them in that moment, something honest in the middle of all the television. After the taping ended and the audience filed out and the crew began breaking down the set, Farrah changed out of the red dress, said her goodbyes, and walked toward the stage door exit. Johnny's producer, Fred de Cordova, was standing near the exit reviewing notes on his clipboard when she paused beside him. She pressed something into his hand, a folded piece of paper, white, torn from a notepad. She said, "Can you give this to Johnny? Not tonight, whenever." She walked out before he could respond. Fred de Cordova kept that note for 23 years until his death in 2001. It was found among his personal papers by his family, who eventually donated a portion of his archives. The note was 3 sentences long. She wrote, "Tonight someone asked if I was okay. I think it's the first time anyone's asked me that in a long time. I'm not sure of the answer yet, but I'm going to find out. 3 sentences. The most honest thing Farrah Fawcett had written in years, and it stayed out of the world's sight for nearly 3 decades. Hit the like button right now if this story is reaching you, and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Because the life that followed that night in 1978 was not a simple story. It was a long, complicated, sometimes beautiful, sometimes devastating account of a woman trying to find out who she was beneath the image the world had made of her. And what she found, the full answer to that question she wrote on that notepad in Fred de Cordova's hand, took 31 more years to come completely clear. By 1979, the marriage to Lee Majors was dissolving. Not in a single dramatic confrontation, but in the slow accumulating way that long partnerships end. Too much distance growing between two people who had once been close enough to bridge any gap, until one day they look at each other and the gap is the whole room. The industry had not been kind to them. Lee was famous, and Farrah had become more famous than Lee, and that particular mathematics is one that very few marriages navigate without damage. There was a careful politeness that had settled between them, the kind that is the opposite of intimacy. Friends who saw them together in those years said it was like watching two courteous people sharing a house. The warmth had become formal, the easiness had gone. She had met Ryan O'Neal. Ryan O'Neal was one of the most desired men in Hollywood in the late 1970s. He was charming and funny and genuinely beautiful, and complicated in all the ways that complicated people tend to be. The qualities that drew people to him were inseparable from the qualities that eventually frightened them. He had a darkness and a volatility that Farrah saw clearly, that she never claimed not to see, and that she was drawn to anyway. Later, she would try to explain what it was about Ryan, and she never quite got there. But what she said most often was that with him she felt looked at, not at the image, but at her. The way Johnny had looked at her in that unscripted moment on camera. That quality of being genuinely seen rather than admired. It was something she could not make herself walk away from. She filed for divorce from Lee Majors in 1980. The divorce was finalized in 1982. She moved through the transition with the external composure she had perfected over years of public life while managing, privately, the particular grief of an ending that you have chosen but that cost you more than you expected to pay. She was not naive about the life with Ryan. She understood it would be turbulent. She chose it anyway because the alternative, the polished surface of something that looked right while the interior hollowed, felt less honest than even a difficult truth. On January 30th, 1985, Farrah gave birth to a son, Redmond James Fawcett O'Neal, and she loved that child with everything she had, which was considerable. People who saw her in those early years of his life said she was transformed by him, that a warmth that had been private in her became visible, and that she was genuinely and completely happy in the way she had been trying to find for years. She had wanted a family the way she had wanted a real acting career, not instead of everything else but alongside it, as evidence that her life added up to something more than photographs. But Redmond would grow into his own darkness, and watching it would be among the most painful things Farrah ever endured. His struggles with addiction began in adolescence and grew more severe as he reached his 20s. There were arrests, there were treatment programs that worked for a while and then stopped. There were years of crisis alternating with fragile periods of recovery, and through all of it Farrah was present, calling, visiting, fighting with doctors and lawyers, refusing to give up on him in the ferocious, persistent way that only a mother who has decided not to look away can sustain. People who watched her in those years said she carried it the way she carried everything, composed on the surface, wrecked underneath, still moving forward. What was less publicly discussed was Farrah's own relationship with substances during those difficult years. It was never as public or as severe as Redmond's. She was not someone who came apart visibly, but people close to her acknowledged that there were periods in the 1980s when the drinking was more than social, when things she had started using to manage anxiety became things she needed more than she had intended. She talked about it later with the honesty that had become her mode when she decided something was worth being honest about. So she said she had managed pain in ways she would have managed differently if she had known better. She had faced it, and she had dealt with it, and she had moved on, which is not the neat resolution that stories usually give to that kind of thing, but which was the actual truth of it. And she had moved on partly because she found something that gave her a reason to get serious. She found the acting she had always known she was capable of. Subscribe right now if this story is reaching you. Because what Farrah Fawcett did next is one of the most remarkable second acts in the history of American entertainment, and almost nobody tells it the way it actually happened. In 1984, she was cast in a television film called The Burning Bed. It was the true story of Francine Hughes, a battered wife who set fire to her sleeping husband's bed after years of abuse. The role required everything that Charlie's Angels had not: physical transformation, emotional exposure, the kind of commitment that strips away every professional protection. Directors had hesitated to cast her. The assumption that she was not capable of it was institutional, embedded in how Hollywood had categorized her since 1976. She had to push for the role. She had to fight for it in a way that would have discouraged someone less determined. The Burning Bed aired on NBC on October 8, 1984. 100 million people watched it. 100 million. It was one of the most watched television films in American history, and the critical response was unlike anything she had received before. People who had spent years writing about Farrah Fawcett as primarily a visual phenomenon had to find new sentences entirely. She was nominated for a Golden Globe. She did not win. But the award was beside the point. She had proven the thing she had been trying to prove since she walked away from Charlie's Angels in 1977. She had proven there was something real inside the image and that it was worth finding. She followed it with stage work, Extremities off-Broadway, a brutal, demanding play about a woman who turns the tables on her attacker, required her to be on stage for nearly the entire play, carrying almost every scene, without the support systems that television and film provide. She was technically outside the comfort zone of everything her career had trained her to do. She did it well enough that critics who attended expecting to be skeptical left writing the opposite of what they had planned to write. She kept working throughout the late 80s and 90s. Not every project was worthy of her. That is the nature of a career sustained over decades. But the seriousness she brought to the work never wavered. And then in 2006, at 59 years old, Farrah Fawcett received a diagnosis: anal cancer. It was rare. It was serious. The doctors caught it at a relatively early stage, treated it, and she went into remission. And then it came back, more aggressively, in a location that made it harder to treat by conventional means. She went to Germany for an experimental course of treatment, a combination of approaches that American oncologists were following carefully because the results in some cases had been meaningful. She made the trip multiple times. The treatment was grueling. Ryan was with her for much of it, inconsistent in the ways he had always been inconsistent, but present in the moments she needed him most. Her friend Alana Stewart traveled with her to Germany repeatedly, filming the experience with a small camera, because Farrah had made a decision. She was going to document this, all of it. Not the managed, professionally lit version of herself that she had spent decades presenting to the world, but the actual thing: the hospital rooms, the bad days, the days when she could not make herself perform any version of strength because she had none left to perform. She said it was because she wanted people to see what the disease actually was, to remove the abstraction that makes illness something that happens to other people rather than to people you know. But it was also something more personal than that. She had spent most of her professional life being looked at without being seen. This was her last chance to change that, to be, for the audience that had watched her for 30 years, completely and finally real. The documentary was called Farrah's Story. She made it with Alana Stewart. It aired on NBC on May 15, 2009. Nearly 9 million people watched it. It showed Farrah in hospital beds and treatment chairs and quiet moments at home, without makeup, without the famous hair carefully arranged, without any of the careful management that had accompanied her public appearances since 1969. It showed her crying and frightened and determined and funny and wholly, completely herself. Critics called it one of the most honest pieces of television in years. Viewers wrote in saying it had changed how they thought about their own lives, their own relationships, their own relationship to time. She died 40 days after it aired. On June 25, 2009, at 10 in the morning, Farrah Fawcett died at St. John's Health Center in Santa Monica, California. She was 62 years old. Ryan O'Neal was at her bedside. Alana Stewart was there. Her son Redmond was not. He was in custody at the time, serving time on drug charges, and there are simply no words that adequately account for the particular weight of that fact, for what it meant to a mother who had fought so hard for him. She knew he was not there. She had made her peace with it the way she made her peace with everything she could not fix, by accepting the truth of it rather than turning away. The world was distracted that day. Michael Jackson died on the same afternoon, and the enormous cultural wave that might otherwise have gathered around Farrah's passing was drawn into the larger current of a different grief. She would have understood. She had spent her whole life being outrun by something larger than herself. She would have seen the irony, and she would have laughed at it because she had the kind of humor that had never been afraid of the dark. Johnny Carson had been gone for 4 years by then, having died in January 2005. But the people who knew him longest said that Farrah was someone he had thought about over the years, not obsessively, not with any extraordinary frequency, but with the kind of quiet consideration you give to people whose essential situation you recognized and who you hope are finding their way. He had seen it that night in 1978, in the 3 seconds when her smile went transparent. He had seen the real person underneath the legend, the woman from Corpus Christi who was trying to answer a question that nobody around her was asking. He would have said she answered it. In the burning bed, she answered it. In extremities, she answered it. In the documentary she made while her body was failing, in which she was more nakedly honest than most people are in an entire lifetime of good health. In every conversation in her later years where she stopped performing and simply talked, she found out. She spent 31 years finding out, and the finding out, the honest and courageous and sometimes messy and always real process of it, was the truest thing about her. That note she pressed into Fred de Cordova's hand on the night of August 11th, 1978, told the whole story, 3 sentences. Someone had asked if she was okay. She was not sure of the answer, but she was going to find out. She was too pretty. That was what they said. Too pretty to be taken seriously. Too pretty to be a real actress. Too pretty to be complicated or frightened or brave or lost or genuinely found. The industry that made her famous spent 20 years telling her that the outside was the whole story. She spent those same 20 years knowing it was not, and fighting sometimes quietly and sometimes loudly to prove it. See, and then she spent the last decade of her life showing the world what the inside actually looked like, without a filter, without a costume, without anything between herself and the people watching. It was the bravest performance she ever gave, and it was not a performance at all. If this story moves something in you, subscribe to this channel right now. We bring you true stories about the people behind the legends, the real lives behind the famous faces, stories that reveal what fame costs, what courage looks like from the inside, and what it means to spend a life trying to be seen. Hit the like button if you believe that what makes a person truly extraordinary is not what they look like, but what they carry and how honestly they carry it. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. And tell me one thing about Farrah Fawcett that you think the world should remember, because I read every single one, and share this with someone who knew her name but never knew her story, because now you do. She was too pretty. That was the verdict the world gave her. She spent her whole life proving it was the least interesting thing about her, and she succeeded. She absolutely succeeded.